The US auto industry had been expecting a slow march, according to Cox Automotive, but instead saw the hottest new car sales in 4 years as buyers rushed out to replace their aging cars before Donald Trump's tariffs on imported cars and car parts, as well as those on imported aluminium and steel kicked in, as these tariffs are expected to drive up the prices of both new and used cars this year. While Trump announced a 90-day pause on many of his Liberation Day tariffs, the hold does not apply to the imported car tariffs. On top of that, it's difficult to say how hard the huge tariffs on Chinese imports will hit the auto industry, as a lot depends on how the Chinese content of imported car parts is treated by US customs. The economists at Cox Automotive updated their sales predictions after the auto tariff announcement came out in March, saying that the rush to buy new cars might continue into May, or until whenever the inventory that dealers built up before the tariffs is drawn down by anxious consumers. They say in their report that they expect new car prices to rise dramatically by the second half of the year, slowing sales noticeably. The New York Times reports that demand has been particularly high for Japanese brands like Honda, Subaru, and Nissan, as buyers assume that they're all imported. All three Japanese companies, however, have factories in the United States, though they do import some cars. When we look at the list of cars with the most American content, 8 of the top 12 brands are non-American brands. Former Reagan economic advisor Arthur Laffer, who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump in 2019, warned in a recent paper that the auto tariffs could add almost $5,000 to the cost of new cars when they kick in, and that the taxes could weaken the ability of US automakers to compete with their foreign counterparts. Laffer later told Fox News that he believes that Trump is a great negotiator and that he could use the tariffs to negotiate freer trade deals with other countries, but said that if the tariffs remain in force and we see an escalation, it would be disastrous for both America and the world economy. Analysts at Wedbush estimate that the tariffs could reduce new auto purchases by up to 20% and raise the prices of a typical car to a US consumer by $5,000 to $10,000. The Center for Automotive Research says that Trump's auto tariffs will increase costs by about $108 billion for US automakers in 2025 alone. They estimate that the average imported vehicle sold in the US will be hit with additional taxes of $8,722, while the Detroit 3 automakers will be hit with an additional tax of $8,641, making them $81 cheaper than the foreign competition. The United Auto Workers Union hailed the tariffs as a victory for auto workers and the end of the 3-decade free trade disaster. US auto manufacturers like Ford and Stellantis responded to the tariffs by announcing temporary deals for employee pricing. The British carmaker Jaguar Land Rover stopped US shipments entirely. The Korean carmaker Hyundai announced that it would not raise prices for at least 2 months to ease consumer concerns. So can manufacturers and dealers just take the hit of the tariffs without passing the cost on to consumers? Well, according to Car Dealer magazine, auto manufacturers make around $2,400 on each new car sold. And according to J.D. Power, dealers charge a markup of around $1,200 per vehicle sold, so there is no way that they can swallow these tariffs and remain profitable. They'll have to pass the cost on to consumers. Is the UAW right that these tariffs are a victory for auto workers? Well, Stellantis have already furloughed 9,000 workers in the United States, and according to research from the Detroit Free Press, the big 3 American automakers will likely see a reduction of about $5 billion in operating profits in North America for the rest of this year due to tariffs. That decline will hit the labor force in their wallets. They say that the tariffs will cost American auto workers who are paid by the hour between $1,000 and $5,000 in profit sharing for the year, and that there will be reductions in bonuses and earnings for salaried workers, executives, and those who work for suppliers too. While the initial impact of the tariffs has been mostly negative, in at least one case, Trump's new taxes have had the intended effect of increasing US production. GM announced last week that it would increase production of light trucks at a factory near Fort Wayne, Indiana. The 25% auto tariffs are expected to cover more than $460 billion worth of imported vehicles and auto parts annually. These tariffs are obviously controversial in a car-centric country like the United States. Longtime viewers know that I rely on my sponsor Ground News when researching polarizing topics like this, so that I can gather factual information stripped of bias. Using Ground News, I can see that over 155 sources are reporting on this topic, and they're about evenly split between the left, the right, and the centre. I can see that 94% of the sources are rated as high factuality, showing the credibility of the source and the timeliness of corrections. On the right, WLOS interviewed a Ford dealer who's excited about the tariffs, saying that he's confident it will help American companies in the long term. On the left, the Rocky Mountain Outlook reports that steep tariffs could drive both new and used car prices, which are already high due to pandemic-related disruptions, even higher. Ground News is particularly useful for topics like this, which have a political edge and an international angle. Their app and website organize the world's news so that you can compare coverage, track missing angles, and spot biases that might shape public perception. For a limited time, you can get the same plan I use for nearly half off. Go to ground.news/pb or scan the QR code on screen to get the Vantage plan for just $5 a month, a small investment in making informed decisions. Importers have been working hard from the moment Trump won the election in November to get ahead of expected tariffs. Everyone knew something like this was in the pipeline. Trump campaigned very heavily on this issue. The FT reports that international car makers rushed to ship vehicles and their core components to the United States before the tariffs hit, and that rush led to a 22% year-on-year rise in vehicle shipments from the EU to the US in February. Those from Japan increased 14%, and shipments from South Korea were up 15%. One person that I spoke to told me that as soon as they saw the news of the assassination attempt last summer, they knew that Trump would win the election and started filling their US warehouses while they could still book freight. CBS reports that Apple flew 600 tons of iPhones into the United States from India before the tariffs were applied. Now that the auto tariffs are in place, the FT reports that many car makers are holding thousands of cars at US ports where the storage fees are quite high, as the tariffs only need to be paid once the cars are removed from the port. The automakers are also trying to move cars into US bonded warehouses where they can temporarily store vehicles without paying this new tax. The article says that many industry executives are hoping that the tariffs won't last for a long time, and they're trying to wait it out. One industry executive warned that the piling of imported vehicles at American ports could get quite ugly, with ports set to fill up fast in a few weeks if the US tariffs are not softened. In terms of who the winners and losers are so far, BBC Top Gear reports that small British manufacturers like Jaguar Land Rover, Lotus and Mini are losers as they don't build cars in the US. Audi doesn't build any cars or engines in the US either, and while Volkswagen has a big US plant, it exports a lot of its US-built cars, and about 2/3 of the cars it sells in the US are foreign-made, and this is just the way modern supply chains work. They say that GM is a big loser too, as it really took advantage of Trump's USMCA deal, and while it has a lot of factories in the US, they rely on other factories in Canada and Mexico. Reconfiguring the US factories would take years and a huge investment. The fact that tariffs are constantly being announced only to be cancelled a few days later means that if they started reconfiguring their US factories, the investment might be wasted if the rules were changed again on them. It's extremely tough for firms to decide what to do in such a rapidly changing business environment. The Wall Street Journal reports that Porsche, which has no US factories, is one of the brands with the least options. Its North American dealers apparently accepted 37% more new cars in the first quarter this year than in the same period of last year. The company's high inventories, they say, implied that it rushed even more cars into the country, but it hasn't delivered them to dealers yet, as Porsche recognizes sales when it sells cars to its dealers. Porsche has seen a fall in demand in Germany and a collapse in demand in China, which was so severe that North America is now its largest market, at least for the moment. Some of the brand cachet of luxury brands like McLaren, Aston Martin, Rolls-Royce and Ferrari is derived from the idea that they're built in their home countries by skilled craftsmen. These companies might be better able to pass the tariffs on to their customers, as there aren't really any American-built rivals for the types of cars that they build. Ferrari already announced that they're increasing pricing in the US by 10% for cars that were ordered but have not yet been delivered. Porsche says that they'll honor pricing for cars that have already been ordered and that they haven't yet decided how they're going to adjust pricing going forward. Ford, Hyundai, Kia, Tesla and Rivian are expected to be the least impacted by the new tariffs, as they have large manufacturing footprints in the US. Ford's production for vehicles it sells in the US is much more local than GM's. Its global operations, according to Top Gear, including the large one in Europe, are well quarantined, as the European factory neither sells many vehicles to the US nor do Europeans buy many of the models built in the United States. American manufacturers will still be hit hard by the new tax, as they use a lot of foreign components, many of which come from China and can be taxed at rates as high as 145%. According to the Center for Automotive Research, the new taxes are expected to cost the Detroit 3 automakers $108 billion. Consumers won't necessarily be able to avoid price hikes by buying American-built cars either, as when the foreign companies are forced to raise prices, domestic manufacturers who are facing lower competition can raise their prices too, increasing their profit margins. And that's usually the whole point of tariffs, to reduce foreign competition and boost the profitability of domestic companies. According to the FT, the biggest losers include German car makers BMW and Mercedes, since many of the parts used in their American-sold vehicles come from Europe. Subaru additionally imports all of the powertrains for its US-sold vehicles from Japan. Car and Driver report that Mercedes initially considered no longer importing its more affordable models to the US, with the plan to focus only on the high-end models, which have more markup. Mercedes have since refuted this claim, saying that they remain focused on sales growth. Toyota, the world's largest car maker, who joined the tech bros and donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration in January, were singled out by Trump in his tariff speech, where he said Toyota sells 1 million foreign cars a year in the US, and went on to say that Japan was the worst violator, and in many cases, the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. The FT reports that Toyota has signaled to its suppliers that it intends to reduce manufacturing costs in response to the tariffs in an attempt to avoid hiking prices on consumers. Most Japanese car makers already have factories in the US and are possibly wary of building any more due to the high costs and low availability of workers in the United States. The overall impact of Trump's new tariffs, which are being rolled out in an extremely chaotic manner, where they're announced one day and cancelled the next, is still unclear, as a lot even depends on how the US Customs and Border Protection interpret the rules on national origin. It's not just the 25% car tariff, there are the tariffs on imported metals and the 125% tax on imported Chinese parts too, which will in many cases be added on top of long existing duties. So some Chinese goods will be hit with tariff rates as high as 245%. Many cars and car parts could be hit with the full tariff on Chinese imports, as in 2019, US Customs and Border Protection decided that Volvo Swedish-built cars should instead be classified as being Chinese cars and subject to much higher tariffs, as while the cars were assembled in Sweden, a lot of the components and sub-assemblies came from China. The courts in cases like this have to decide how transformational the assembly of parts into a finished product are, and there is, of course, plenty of room for maneuver in that decision. Sam Lowe writes in the FT that while there are rules around this, it can still be extremely difficult to predict which way US Customs will go on a specific issue. There are still numerous unanswered questions around how import tariffs will be calculated. Sam Lowe writes on his Substack about how a tariff can be applied on the steel and aluminium content of downstream products like sports equipment. If this type of calculation is applied to cars and car parts, it means that each imported good could be assessed a tariff based on the weighted average of the national origin of its component parts, assuming that the importer is willing to fill out all of the necessary paperwork to prove that. According to the White House tariff proclamation, if U.S. Customs and Border Protection determines that the declared value of non-U.S. content of an automobile is inaccurate, the 25% tariff will apply to the entire value of the vehicle, regardless of its actual U.S. content. This puts importers in a very difficult position. Donald Trump has said that he couldn't care less if car prices rise as a result of his tariffs. According to The Economist, the cars that will be most affected are the cheap ones that would be unprofitable to import or manufacture domestically. KPMG are predicting that US automakers who are slightly less impacted than foreign brands are likely to focus on building larger, heavier SUVs and pickup trucks, which are already mostly assembled in the United States and have the most markup, giving automakers the most room to absorb the cost of tariffs without passing them on to customers. The average price of a new car in the United States is already around $50,000. If manufacturers are going to get rid of affordable models, the days of the average American being able to afford a new car will be over. It seems unlikely that tariffs will encourage companies to open new factories until they're certain that the new tariffs are permanent and that investing billions of dollars in new production capacity will pay off for them in the long run. Should that happen, they'll have to pass on the cost of building a new factory and the higher wage costs to American consumers, who will then be paying more for cars than anyone else in the world. If the tariff barrier was taken down, let's say if Trump struck one of his famous deals, the factories would quickly become unprofitable and need to be shuttered. Bloomberg has described Trump's tariff announcement as the biggest inflationary event for the auto industry since the COVID pandemic, when automakers went months without being able to make new vehicles. They report that some dealerships have been calling up customers who bought cars from them a few years ago, offering to buy the used car back for more than it cost new. Apparently, the rush by consumers to buy ahead of tariffs has pushed used car inventories so low that dealers are now desperate to buy popular models at any price so that they can quickly flip them. NPR reports that while some buyers have been rushing out to buy a car before prices rise, others are delaying purchases because they're worried about their jobs being at risk in the shaky economic environment, or they're trying to build up savings in case of a recession. They say that some shoppers are hurrying up, others are stepping back. Meanwhile, the tariffs themselves keep changing. While many would still argue that US manufacturers are the big winners from these tariffs, A complicating factor is how foreign countries and foreign consumers respond. Bloomberg reports that Canada's retaliatory tariffs will hit US manufacturers the hardest. Under Canada's new rules, the tariffs on an imported vehicle will depend on where its components come from, and Mexican parts are exempt under the USMCA. Under the Canadian rules, if a car is assembled at a US factory with 80% US content and 20% Mexican or Canadian components, the 25% tax will apply to the US content only, resulting in a total tariff rate of 20%. Bloomberg reports that Tesla has stopped taking orders in China for the Model S sedan and the Model X minivan, both of which are imported from the US. They had to do this after China announced retaliatory tariffs on the United States. Another problem for American brands is that there's growing evidence of shoppers around the world refusing to buy American brands. The most prominent example is international customers refusing to buy Tesla cars. But there's also been the emergence of barcode scanning apps that allow shoppers to reject American products. Danish stores have even started tagging European goods to allow consumers to buy them instead of American brands. And most amusingly, a Swedish Facebook group has been set up calling for the boycott of US companies, including Facebook itself. So if you join that group, you've already failed at your goal. According to the FT, the number of Europeans traveling to the United States has cratered since Trump took office, and cancellation rates for bookings to the US were 16% higher in the first quarter this year than a year earlier, with travelers from business centres like the UK, Germany, and France showing an even higher cancellation rate of 40%. Forbes reports a 70% drop in travel between Canada and the United States. It's very hard to imagine how any of this could be good for US businesses. It would appear that while they've just been introduced, the new tariffs are already causing problems for the auto industry. The cost of insuring against debt defaults in Europe's car industry has exploded, with small manufacturers being hit the hardest. Aston Martin, which was already unprofitable, is heavily exposed to Trump's tariffs, as they don't build in the United States, and US customers account for 37% of their revenues. Car component makers have been hit too, and the FT reports that auto parts suppliers are likely to be hit the hardest by the tariffs due to their lower margins. Some argue that while everyone else is playing checkers, Donald Trump is playing 4D golf. But it's hard to argue that the rollout of Trump's tariffs have been anything other than chaotic. It's not obvious that there's any real strategy, and it doesn't appear that Trump's economic advisors know what's going on any more than the rest of us do. Over the last few days, we've seen massive tariff announcements which have thrown markets into chaos before being delayed for 90 days. While the market rebounded on the announcement of the delays, the remaining tariffs are still extremely high, at 10% on all countries, 25% on cars and steel, and over 125% on China. On Saturday, we saw an announcement that smartphones, routers, chip-making equipment, computers, and laptops would be exempt from the tax on Chinese imports. And then on Sunday, the US Commerce Secretary walked that back, saying that the products are included in the semiconductor tariffs, which are coming in probably a month or two. When asked to clarify whether tariffs on Apple iPhones might come back in a month or so, Nutlick replied, "Correct, that's right. We need our medicines and we need our semiconductors and our electronics to be built in America."
Army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones. That kind of thing is going to come to America.
The Economist made the argument a few days ago that the tariffs could hit the Chinese economy hardest by causing such a severe slowdown in the US economy that demand from America dries up. That's not really the victory that anyone's hoping for. Ku Jin, a professor at LSE, made an argument in the FT a few days ago that if Washington's aim is to suppress China's rise, it's going about it the wrong way. She argues that tariffs don't just alter trade flows, they redirect resources and reshape industrial structures. She says that if Trump's goal was to curb China's technological progress, he would keep tariffs low on the bulk of Chinese exports to the US, locking the country into low-margin basic manufacturing. He would encourage high-tech exports to China, making sure that progress in its advanced components stalls. She points out that this is the opposite of what's actually happening. Ironically, just as the China shock pushed the US out of low-end manufacturing, the Trump shock is propelling China to reallocate resources into higher value advanced technologies that compete directly with the United States. Most economists agree that something does need to be done to rebalance global trade, but the on-again, off-again tariffs being announced on a daily basis based on formulas that appear hastily thrown together, appear to just be damaging both business confidence and consumer confidence in the United States and around the world. If you found this video interesting, you should watch my video, Are Exports the Only Source of Growth Next?, which was based on the Michael Pettis book, The Great Rebalancing. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Ground News, using the link in the description, and talk to you in the next video. Bye.